So what is philosophy? Today I'm going to try to answer that question. What is philosophy? What are its outcomes? Like, what is it trying to do? What are its processes or methodologies? And what is it that drives the philosopher to do what they do? Interestingly, both professional philosophers and normal people often say that philosophy is pointless, or that it is meaningless, or that there's nothing that comes out of it. And yes, I did say professional philosophers, because a great deal of 20th century and 21st century philosophy has to do with coming to terms with the fact that philosophy in many ways is completely meaningless. Now, I'm saying that professional philosophers are in many ways saying what normal people are saying, people who've gone to college courses or people who've thought philosophically, perhaps accidentally, only to turn around and say that it's meaningless, that it's irrelevant, that it has nothing to do with life. My name is John Edward Willey, and I hope to challenge this position and augment it by offering my own sense of what philosophy is. You know how the quiet person in the room is often overlooked, like that person who's sort of contemplating in the corner, sort of leaving everyone alone? They're more often not taken to be meaningless themselves. In other words, those who perhaps are contemplative or who are like thinking about ideas can be seen as having no effect on anything. My claim is that that's completely wrong. In fact, there's nothing more powerful, nothing more dangerous, and nothing more astonishingly fun than philosophy. Now, philosophy doesn't have to be defended. The question, what is philosophy, answers itself in the way that many things do, which is that philosophy is intrinsically, automatically interesting. It's fun to philosophize. And so it doesn't need justification. It doesn't need a reason. I do it automatically because I am philosophical. I was born philosophical. But there are other answers to the question. You know, there's a mathematical kind of answer, which is that philosophy is a kind of conceptual engineering. That is, what philosophers do is break apart ideas and work backwards to see what originated those ideas, and therefore to get a better comprehension or sense of the ideas and concepts that, when you look at it, actually form the basis of everything in our world, from economics to psychology, to politics, to engineering. All of it is rooted in particular conceptual notions that philosophers explore. And of course, much of this doesn't require exploration, given that chemistry and physics and biology and everything else functions perfectly fine without philosophy. So there is a sense in which philosophy is antiquated because biology and all these other things that have come out of philosophy have moved beyond its need to question its own foundations. Now, that's one sense of what philosophy is, and a more affirmative sense of what that would mean would be that we are thinking rigorously about why we believe what we do and how we believe what we do. And we're attempting to get better at clarifying what we think. At least becoming aware of what we think is a significant breakthrough. Believe it or not, most people are hardly aware of what they believe. Of course, they have beliefs, but these surface level beliefs often or always assume things. They're based on other assumptions that are usually hidden or disclosed to the person who's philosophizing. And so much of what goes on in philosophy is a kind of unburying. You're unburying yourself. You're taking a conceptual shovel and you're sort of digging into your notions, your dreams, your fantasies, your beliefs, and you're seeing what they have underneath them. And it's the investigation of these things that live underneath what we think that philosophers live almost as worms, almost as archaeologists. Now, I did say that this was meaningless, so how would it be meaningful, right? What would be the purpose of it? And why is it that I say that philosophy is so astonishingly important, or why it's so earth-shattering and life-changing? It's because philosophy in its origin is the love of wisdom. That's what philosophe means, the love of wisdom. But wisdom, is, for the ancient Greeks, or for what philosophers think of it, has nothing to do with the wisdom that we assume to be wisdom. Because I think that the wisdom that philosophers love has a little bit more to do with a sense of awe, a sense of like amazement, a sense of mystery about the world. So philosophy sort of begins with a sense of mystery, a sense of uncertainty about who we are and what we're doing, and a desire to explore that as fully as possible and to live through the consequences of that exploration. And what that means is that the state of wonderment, the state of bewilderment about being alive, about being here at all, that's like the fuel in philosophy. So if you don't have that sense of like wide-eyed amazement at being alive, at being here at all, not that you have to like carry this on for the rest of your life, but to have that moment at least once, is the fundamental basis of philosophy. Because it's in that kind of felt experience, I think, that the ideas then begin to take shape and begin to have a purpose and have a reason. Now, what I mean is that there's a particular kind of existential quality that goes along with being human, which means that we're born into particular predicaments that we can't sort out, that we can hardly make sense of. And so much of what philosophizing is an attempt to enunciate these ideas that we didn't even decide to have, but we were sort of thrown into, and then we are wrestling with the repercussions of those ideas that we were born into. And that's only one small element of it, because the other elements of philosophy have to do with simply being amazed at the hugeness of everything, the enormity of everything, and our smallness. That's one example. How do we make sense of that? How do we go on believing that life has meaning or has a sense of purpose when we know full well, in looking through telescopes, that our whole existence is meaningless? So how do we make sense of that? And is that the last thought? Is that the final thought that you have? Philosophy resists the smugness, the self-certainty that everyone has, which plays a part in why they feel the way that they do. And so much of what philosophy is tapping into ideas that once they are challenged, once they begin to change, the very sense or feeling of how you are in the world begins to change. Now that's like something that happens at the end of the process, through the process of philosophizing. It's not something that one begins with. But one has to begin with a sense of questions, of mystery, that the world is mysterious, that we don't know everything, that there's quite a bit to know. And not only is there quite a bit to know, but there's quite a bit that we know that isn't true and that must be investigated. So to philosophize is to participate in this messy, mostly non-systematic process of attempting to reverse conceptual engineer, all the while taking into consideration all of these other things that make life what it is and sort of is a precondition for thinking. And if you begin with like the ancient Greeks and the birth of chemistry and history, you can see that it's precisely this sense of uncertainty that is the fundamental basis. When combined with like a sense of courage, it turns into this like desire to further examine and explore all of the things that we take to be true or take to be natural, and to sort of test those as much as we can. And by testing them, we mean using logic, using philosophical ideas about what counts as knowledge, what counts as belief. And in doing this, we sort of discover the origin of the physical sciences, in that the very desire to understand emerges out of a sense that there's a contradiction in our beliefs, that there's something unsustainable or meaningless or empty about our beliefs. Therefore, we negate those beliefs. We have the courage to destroy those beliefs. So then what do? Once we discover something isn't true, do we simply replace it with another idea? Well, philosophy opens up a capacity to synthesize and to work in ways that can put together the information that we have to conceive of another position, to conceive of another point of view. And so philosophy is twofold. On the one hand, it has to do with taking apart, deconstructing, analyzing our beliefs and ideas and stories. But a part of my pitch is that this is only the first half of philosophy. And I think that the other half is completely left out. And it's no wonder that people feel so completely meaningless and empty and vacuous. It's no wonder that philosophy is seen as pointless or meaningless. Now, it's also because I'm infusing into this a sense of what philosophy is that is really lost on most philosophers in America and England today, which is that philosophy has something to do with your life, and that philosophy has something to do with your existential conditions. And what that means in relation to what I was just saying is that philosophy as a constructive project means that we begin putting back together our beliefs, except that we're continuing to test them logically and to attempt to think thoroughly about them, but we're not merely replacing our other beliefs. We're developing new, more organic, better beliefs. Of course, you could just simply buy into what anyone else is telling you to think. In fact, that's what most people's instincts are, to find someone to tell them what to think. And so you can see the danger in philosophy in that it's placing like autonomy on particular people. It's an autonomy that like demands that you see that you have to make the choices as to what counts as what. And not only that, but you have to live through those choices. You have to live through those ideas. And so that's a kind of way of thinking that's extremely uncomfortable to most people. And to be honest, most people, they don't like having their beliefs challenged. They don't like having their ideas uncovered. They don't like being put on the spotlight. It's extremely difficult because in many ways our entire sense of selfhood, our sense of identity and unity is constructed along these lines. And so when one begins to philosophize, you're not doing something meaningless or or empty. In fact, it's the most meaningful thing you can do, because the very sense of who we are is actually originated in these terms that can then be challenged. But that opens up a kind of messiness that is the human situation. And I think that philosophy is the closest of all subjects to attempting to articulate that situationalism that we find ourselves in, and to attempt to clarify what a process would even look like what a methodology would look like. And that's an important thing about philosophy, because rather than being a set of beliefs, or rather than it being about things like containing information or containing knowledge, it's actually a process. Philosophy is a discipline of learning how to think more clearly, more rigorously, more creatively, and to not only take your part of life, but to put together a vision of the whole, a vision of who you are that isn't fake, that isn't full of lies and too many inconsistencies, because there are going to be inconsistencies. But what one is wanting to do is to create not a vision, it's not a construction, but an understanding of the world that is true to the analytical process, but also affirms our ability to see things anew and to put the pieces back together and to have a kind of vision of the whole. And that is very unpopular in philosophy. You know, it's often seen as like rude to want to do what the ancient Greeks were doing, or what my beloved Florentines were doing, which was to affirm a vision of the world that could hold together everything that has been left over from the catastrophe. And so philosophy has like an intimate relation to catastrophe, and it's no wonder that most philosophical movements of any merit arise out of catastrophic situations, like the Florentines emerging from the bubonic plague in the 13th century, or the European Enlightenment emerging out of political and religious wars. You can see that these processes of taking apart beliefs can destroy people. It can take them apart and they never get put back together again, or it presents a profound opportunity. And so to philosophize is to live through that profound opportunity of discovering who you are. That's precisely what the examined life is. And I know that none of this makes any sense really, because I'm really just trying to think spontaneously and trying to think in a very casual way while I walk. When I write and when I think normally, it's a very kind of rigorous way. In fact, it almost like gets in its own way. And so it's difficult to produce writing, but that's what writing is. And I find that these kind of conversations, these kind of walk and talks are far easier. And not only that, they're far more interesting than attempting to like speak a script, because there's sort of like a spontaneity and like self-examination and discovering who I am through these videos, through speaking in a vulnerable way, attempting to like put together ideas, knowing that I don't make any sense to anybody hardly, but that over time I am slowly making sense of these underlying notions and ideas. And the fundamental idea that has driven me for quite a long time is the philosophical life, the idea that the unexamined life isn't worth living. So if the unexamined life isn't worth living, what is the examined life? That's philosophy. And yet, when one is getting into it, it doesn't have any meaning or point or at all. It doesn't have any sense of direction, you know? And so it's no wonder that it's left behind, but perhaps that's like for the better, because it means there's more for us. And not only that, but that if everyone was doing it, it would probably become so dangerous that it would destroy society completely. So perhaps it's ideal that a person can only think a little philosophically in a little bit of time, given that anything more than that could possibly destroy them completely. I'm John Edward Willie.